Tonight we're in lesson 7 on our series here on regulating our emotions and specifically how to overcome anxiety. And so a lot of these notes are taken from our 1-year-long class that will be starting in the fall. When I write this material, I have to take a lot of different, like 5,000 sheets of paper and kind of sift through them and figure out what I want to put in this short 12-week series. 12 weeks isn't really short when you look at it, but when you compare it to a year long. So there's a lot of stuff that you'll be gaining, and a lot of what you're learning here, you'll hear again if you stick with us during the year-long class. But that repetition is what really helps us. It's amazing how many things we need to hear a couple times, before it really starts sticking. And so tonight we're going to start. Last time we talked about our beliefs and how our beliefs can affect our anxiety. And a lot of psychology is based on cognitive behavioral therapy. That's the big one out there, the evidence-based, where they go and they work on our thoughts. And last week we presented a lot of things, on how to work with your thoughts, and I'd encourage you to go back through the notes. If you don't have the notes, or if you're watching tonight or this week for the first time, I encourage you to write me, ron@empowerministry.org, and I'll be happy to send you the notes. We also have all the notes from the previous class laid out in the back there, so if you haven't had some. But take some time during the week to go over it. Now, if you're going to look for spelling corrections and errors and that, they'll be there, because I haven't sent this to an editor, okay? This is my, and the older I get, the worse it gets sometimes. So this is pre-edited material. But that's not the point. The content's what's the point here. And so I encourage you to read it again and pray over it and say, Lord, teach me, because these things are caught more than they're taught. One time isn't just going to get you as far as if you go over it a little more. So I encourage you to do that. Well, we talked about thoughts. Tonight we're going to talk about the other part of our emotions, which I think when we talk about it will make sense to you. And how we can regulate it. So let's just ask God to speak to our hearts tonight, open our minds to understand some of this. So Father, you know who we are. Lord, all about anxiety. You created us with this marvelous brain and body. And Father, you know how we can regulate it. So teach us tonight, open our hearts to hear these things. Give us wisdom, Father, and with the wisdom, give us understanding. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, last time, like I said, we looked at the different kinds of thoughts and beliefs that can cause anxiety and what we can do with them, okay? So thoughts, beliefs, predictions, they trigger us, and they cause us then to react emotionally. And we go into a fight or flight or freeze. And so that's the part of anxiety, like I said, that's usually talked about. But what we want to talk about tonight is that there's actually 2 different parts of the brain that affect anxiety. When we're talking about a belief system, we're talking about the prefrontal cortex. And if you were here weeks ago, we went through, we talked about the brain and the different parts of the brain. And that rational part of the brain is where a lot of our thinking, we get our stinking thinking, right? And so we have to correct some of that. But there's a second part that causes us to react, and that's the amygdala, or the limbic, the emotional area of the brain. Now, that has to go off anyways, whether it's from a thought or anything else. But what happens when we're looking at the amygdala causing it, a lot of times it's because of a felt belief. It's a sensation. Something triggered us. If you know anything about addictions, you've probably heard the term trigger a lot, because all of a sudden you get a craving and it was triggered somehow. Well, this is a similar thing. Something is coming through our senses, whether it's something we see, something we smell, something we hear, something we feel. Something triggered us, and it caused us then to react. And in this case, we're talking about anxiety. It got us anxious. And so we want to look at that, because we want to look at, especially next week, some of the techniques that we can use to calm it down, because it's a combination our sensations, our body posture, autonomic nervous system, all that works together. And when we can learn how to work with that, we can actually regulate our emotions. And that's taught a lot now. The emotional regulation is becoming more and more popular. My point, though, is that we want to go beyond that, and we will in a couple weeks when we talk about emotional relearning, because we don't want to just keep coping. Coping's fine, and we'll teach you the coping skills. But I'd rather us really change, right? We'd rather not have the constant anxiety if we don't have to. You know, I can teach you how to calm down a panic attack, right? But wouldn't it be better if you didn't have panic attacks anymore? For those of you that had them, right? Right? The goal here is to really not have as much anxiety and know how to tame the anxiety as we go along. So, now, when activated, we're in the third paragraph on page 1 now. When activated by danger, the amygdala looks for the source of that danger. Now, I'm using specific parts. You know, as we learn more about neuroscience, you know, someone's going to say, oh, no, it's not that part, it's this axis. And, you know, it doesn't matter. Tomato, tomato, right? I mean, the teaching right now is the amygdala, but really it comes through the hypothalamus. Do you really want to know all that? You know, I don't think, you know, we're not here to memorize all that. But what happens, sensations come into the brain and it triggers us. That's the point here. And then, now, at that moment, when danger comes, the amygdala, it makes an association. It makes association. And that association may be true, or in some cases, it's wrong. For example, if you touched a hot stove, what do you think your brain would tell you? Move, right? That's after you go, wow, right? I don't know if the brain have to tell you to move, you're already moving it, right? But that's really the brain is signaling. Pain is coming through, going up, saying, whoa, move it, right? That's an association, because next time you see a glowing hot stove, you're not going to touch it probably, because the brain, the amygdala is saying, danger, danger, right? Well, I have an example, and I may have shared this before, but when I was around 10, 11 or something, I was out working, playing ball, real hot and sweaty, and an ice cream truck came by. At least I thought it was. It was a bakery, Ari Bakery in Detroit. But it said ice cream on it. So I thought, oh, cool, you know. But all they had really was these drumstick type things, but it was French vanilla. Well, vanilla was the key word. I didn't know nothing about French vanilla. I noticed there was little specks in it, but it was real rich. You know the difference, the French vanilla, real rich. And so it left an impression on me. It wasn't just your normal vanilla. Well, that's fine, but when I got home later, a couple hours later, I was nauseous. I got real sick. Now, it could have been because it was so hot, I was running and playing, and could have been pizza I had for breakfast, I don't know, you know, but something, and my stomach was upset, and I had a bad night. Well, because some of the stuff that came to my taste buds was French vanilla, guess what I never wanted to touch again? Yeah, French, you ever do that? That was an association. Last thing I ate must have made me sick. I'm not going to touch. The thought of French vanilla ice cream for years just, you know. Well, I remember once I was somewhere and I just had this craving for ice cream. And I was older then, probably 16 or something, and the only thing they had was French vanilla. But I was older and much wiser, so I decided that I'd go ahead and try it. Well, I didn't get sick. In fact, it tasted pretty good. And what I did then, the first association said what? Don't eat French vanilla. It's going to make you sick. Now, was that true or not? Really wasn't true. I got sick, but the association was false, okay? The second experience when I ate it and didn't get sick taught me what? Yeah, French vanilla, it won't make me sick. So see how the brain makes those associations, and we have thousands upon thousands of them that we make all the time. And the point is, and why I share that, is that because a lot of the associations we have are false. They're false. They're not true. And the reason they feel true is because we think of them so fast and we just go on our merry way. We react to them, we believe them, and so it just continues this continual belief of something that's wrong. So the language of the amygdala is experiential knowledge. It's experiential knowledge. It's associations, okay? Now, when it comes to anxiety, we want to use both. We want to correct our thinking, and we want to correct our reactions. Now, once I knew French vanilla wasn't going to make me sick, I corrected my thinking, right? So that's cortex-based. So next time I was going to try French vanilla, the thought may come to me, I'm going to get sick. What did my brain, you think, tell me? No, I was correcting my thinking. Now, what if my body was reacting a little bit? I'd have to focus on my body, right? Relax and say, okay, take it easy, I'm going to be fine, right? So I use both. Okay, that's the point here. Look on the bottom of page 1. Imagine your anxiety is a car and you're heading full speed toward a cliff. You have 2 brakes here. One is the cortex. You can rethink something. Well, this isn't going to bother me, right? And so we can put those brakes on. The other one is the amygdala, and that's that calming. And we'll talk about the calming techniques. We can do that. Now, the point is, some work better than others. Sometimes we need to think things through. Other times, just relaxing and doing the calming techniques will work. I like to teach both. I'd just rather use both breaks, right? Because then we're taking care of the problem, not just the symptoms. In their book, Rewired Anxious Brain, Catherine Pittman and Elizabeth Carroll, they built a case for it, and you can look on page 2 here. Until recently, treatments for anxiety were less likely to take the amygdala pathway into consideration. The amygdala is a small, but it's made up of thousands of circuits of cells dedicated to different purposes. These circuits influence love, bonding, sexual behavior, anger, aggression, and fear. And the role of the amygdala is to attach emotional significance. Do you understand? Underline it. Emotional significance, okay? To situations or objects and to form emotional memories. When we have trauma, a lot of times what happens is cortisol starts pumping through the body and it shuts off the hippocampus, which is the memory part. Instead, that amygdala is saying, okay, what do I have to know? What does the brain have to know not to get in trouble again? If it was, a silver car that came at me and almost hit, what am I going to feel next time a silver car is coming down the road? At first I might be a little shook, right? And then I have to know, well, not all silver cars are the same. I don't have to worry about that, and I can retrain. But the amygdala is going to look for something that's characteristic that I need to remember where I won't have that danger again. Okay, and now the trouble is a lot of that comes from childhood. And even though we're more mature now, we're older now, we still have some of those same fears from childhood and the same belief system. And so if we had a person that looked at us a certain way and, triggered, let us know that they're disgusted with us, the next time someone doesn't like something we say and they give us that same look, that disgust look, you're going to feel it. Because it's going right back to that early age when you were younger, and you're going to feel that until you realize and retrain yourself that, hey, this doesn't have to bother me. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? And you'll be amazed how many things there are like that that we go through. And so we tend then to think of these things. And so what she was saying here is that these circuits, these emotions and emotional memories can be positive or negative. And in her book, she says, we'll focus on the way the amygdala attaches anxiety into experience and creates anxiety-producing memories. This will help you to understand the amygdala so you can learn how to change its circuitry to minimize anxiety. And we do that by retraining, okay? And we're going to talk about 3 different ways we'll do that. We humans aren't consciously aware of the way the amygdala attaches anxiety to situation or objects, just like we aren't consciously aware of the liver aiding digestion. And I thought that was a good example. We aren't consciously aware that right now our body's doing a bunch of things in the background. Likewise, we're not conscious that the body, the mind, the brain is searching the environment to make us safe, okay? And so, however, the amygdala's emotional processing has profound effects on our behavior. The amygdala is at the very heart of where the anxiety response is produced. Although the cortex can initiate or contribute to anxiety, that's the thinking, the amygdala is required to trigger the anxiety response. This is why a thorough approach to addressing anxiety requires dealing with both the cortex pathway and the amygdala. So I encourage you to go over last week's notes again, because it deals with the way we think, and what we're talking about tonight is our sensations, okay? Now, emotions start as sensations. The root word of emotion means to move. It means to move. It gets us to move. Sensations, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, all those things get us to move. I was in my office working at home, and I heard some scratching on the wall. Well, that caught my attention. I thought, is that inside or outside? You know, because it makes a big difference to me, you know. And so I had to get up and stop what I was doing, check the closet, check around, make sure it wasn't inside, okay? But isn't it? I'm just minding my own business, but something was out of context, right? Something I heard. Smell can do the same thing. You know, the other day I was out walking, and all of a sudden I smelled, gas, coming from someone's house, So I just lit a match to see if it was, no, I didn't. But anyways, that it alarmed me a little bit, and I thought I'd better run. But it wasn't that significant, but it's something that caught my attention. Same thing, when we hear things, we see things, those things are going on. And right now, you are sensing all kinds of things, but you're not aware of it. The brain is not going to allow you to. It would be overload. We wouldn't be able to handle it. But the brain, nevertheless, is sifting. The reticular activating system and everything is sifting all that through. And it will allow things that are important to you. I've given examples before of when we had our first baby. My wife would hear him cry in the middle of the night. I wouldn't, But if something thudded on the roof, she'd be sleeping, and I'd be, what's that, because we had priorities. I should have had better priorities, I guess, but, I handled the roof, she handled the baby, so. But, I learned by our time we had our third child, that I needed to help a little bit, right? But anyway, so we have that. And so emotions are really those sensations that get us to move. If a danger has been associated with a specific sensation, it will be tagged, in our brain as something we need to be aware of. And that's classic association. It's classic association. Now, here's the thing. Associations can be wrong. Remember the vanilla ice cream, right? Some things that we're worried about, that are anxious, are built on lies. And you're going to hear me say that ad nauseum, okay? And I hope that what that causes you to do is to figure out what are the lies that I am, meaning you, are believing, okay? So now, to give you an example of how the body works and the brain works, Antonio Damasio is a famous psychologist who's done a ton of things on brain research. He set up an experiment, and I think it was with 5 decks of cards, and he had different students that he did the test with. And what he would do, he put electrodes on the fingers, much like a lie detector, so it picked up little sensations going on in the fingers, okay? If something was startled, it would go through the fingers, and it would sense, the lie detector thing would kind of go like this. Well, what they did is that they had to draw cards from the deck. And they rigged 2 of the decks to where it would be a loser. So you get so many points. And what would happen is that it took like quite a few turns, like 50 or so, before the people started to hesitate on the 2 of the decks. It took them a while to figure out, hey, maybe these decks are rigged. And they started to hesitate as they gave feedback afterwards. But it even took another 18 to 20 or so moves before they finally said, hey, this is rigged. It took them quite a few things to finally figure it out. Well, when they were done, and they looked at the lie detector kind of printout, right? It was it was early in the game that the fingers, whenever they went toward one of those two decks, the fingers would send that thing going. Their mind knew somehow they were able to tell that something was wrong, but their brain, the prefrontal cortex, didn't pick it up yet, but their amygdala did. The emotional part of the brain said, this might not work out, and then like that. It was a landmark discovery that started teaching us that we're aware of things much quicker sometimes than we are in our prefrontal cortex. And I give an example a lot of times. I told you about when I was scared of the basement, but I was a little older. I went down there, and I thought, I don't need to be scared. And all of a sudden, there it was, the big monster, right? I looked, and it's there, and I'm ready to run out, but I'm older now, and I think I can't do this, and I'm like this. But I waited just long enough. I waited long enough, and looking hard enough, all of a sudden I saw it was my mom's dress that she had hung up to dry. She hung it on the conduit, so it was real high on the ceiling. And all of a sudden I said, oh, and I relaxed and calmed down. My emotions were scared first, but the prefrontal cortex a lot of times is a millisecond and a half or more later. And if we don't slow down, if we don't stop, we're never going to get that prefrontal cortex online to help us. So it's that combination. We need to calm the sensations down where we can rationally think of what's going on. Does that make sense? Okay? So, now, the question here I have down at the bottom of 2 is how many times you have to touch a hot stove before you don't touch it again? Usually once, right? And that's because there's a strong association made. What is interesting, however, is that, the hippocampus can differentiate between a stove that's hot and one that's not. And so you're not going to be afraid necessarily of going up to a stove if you can distinguish that the burners aren't red, for example, if it's an electric stove, right? Well, however, many times the amygdala becomes oversensitive, and this is a key. This oversensitization then causes a problem because what happens then is that we won't go near any stove. You see what I'm saying? And a lot of our anxiety is that way. It becomes hyper anxiety. It becomes hyper. And what we've done is taken an association like don't touch a hot stove to the point of don't touch any stove. So it becomes almost a little more phobic, right? It becomes a little stronger. And a lot of our anxieties have taken that kind of life on. It happens so quick, we don't even argue with it. It happens so quick, we've generalized it. Remember, the goal of the brain is to protect you, not to necessarily be right, to protect you. And if it has an association, an assumption of what's wrong, you've allowed it, it's going to continue. And here's the other thing. The brain's other part of your protection is to save energy. Do you know 30% of our energy is created by our brain? And so the goal is to conserve energy. And so what happens, what was a well-worn pathway at first, pretty soon it starts generalizing. It just assumes more and more because you're not stopping it. And so it's easy to go from the hot burner stove to all stoves. Now I know that's a silly example, you would probably never do that, but there are a lot of things that we would be. You got beat up on an alley one day, now we don't go down any alleys, right? Or we get nervous if we ever we got hurt one time at night, we don't go out at night. You see what I'm saying? It's not that hard and difficult to make stronger associations. So, trauma affects our sensations on the bottom of page 2 here. Dr. Robert Scare has done extensive work in the field of trauma. And he writes this, he says, we therefore seem to be dealing, and he's talking about post-traumatic stress here, dealing with a syndrome affecting all aspects of a person's being, including body, mind, and spirit. So he's talking about anxiety as a strong case of anxiety, but anxiety does affect our body, mind, and spirit. This post-traumatic syndrome is produced by a threat, shock, or injury that occurs in a state of helplessness. Now, underline that, okay? A state of helplessness, because that's important. You may not be helpless now, but when you were a child, and a lot of these things have their root in childhood, when that person looked at you that certain way and humiliated you or shamed you or threatened you, whether it was a caregiver, a teacher, a friend, a bigger sibling or whatever, you were only so tall. And so that had a strong significance then. But now as a grown-up, I still have someone look at me that way and I still react that way. I'm reacting like I'm down here, right? And they're way up there, but we're not. I'm an adult. There's things I can do now as an adult, but I don't give myself that chance because I'm still reacting. And I'd just rather avoid or get angry or whatever, whatever our pattern is. And that's because when we were young, we were helpless. We were helpless. And that's why a lot of trauma is hard to overcome, because usually we're in a helpless state, whether we're an adult and we get mugged, right? We get beat up, real horrible. I mean, we were caught off guard. It was 3 against 1, whatever it was a state of helplessness. And the trouble is, it's hard to overcome that feeling, even though we may have the tools we need today, okay? So sometimes we have to look at that and ask ourselves, and that's where what we taught last week might really help. That's why that's used a lot in post-traumatic stress, because we can start looking at some of the whys. Why'd that happen? What am I believing about that? We would question, are you really helpless now, you see? And so we would approach some of the thinking, but we would also have to approach the feelings, right? Because when you feel panicked, you aren't thinking, right? So just changing the thoughts alone, we have to retrain the body as well. Is that making sense? Okay? All right. Now, the post-traumatic stress syndrome is produced by threat, shock, or injury that occurs in a state of helplessness, and the neurophysiological changes triggered by these experiences are somehow stored in a person's unconscious procedural memory. That's what we were saying earlier. We call that implicit memories, in a cumulative manner. Now, he's saying a mouthful here. What happens is once we're afraid of that thing once, and then we're afraid of it again, then we're afraid of it again, then we're afraid of it again. It has a cumulative effect. We're reinstating it and re-believing it every time. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's scarier, but what it does mean is that we start reacting quicker and just as strongly as we did before. We're not slowing the process down, we're reinforcing it. And so it has a cumulative effect. What I may have doubted in the early stages, I don't doubt anymore. I'm just reacting now. And the good news is that once we know that, we can start saying, well, hold it. Maybe I don't have to react, okay? And that's what I want us to start thinking of, is that I do not have to react this way, okay? I may feel like it, but I don't have to. The trouble is, what he's saying is that you're going to feel like you have to, because it's a well-worn pathway now, okay? So accumulation of traumatic life experiences then leads to a condition of increasing vulnerability and decreased resiliency, all right? And our course is called Emotional Resilience. So when we continue this, it decreases resilience. The example I give a lot is a young child, let's say it was my granddaughter, and she feels self-conscious about school, that she doesn't feel she's popular, she's got some body images or something going on, social phobia perhaps. And so she goes to school very reluctantly, and she walks kind of the walk of shame, and of course the popular kids are over there, and she can't help but look, because she has to see, And she looks and looks down again, looks again, and she sees two of them laughing. And they caught each other's eye. Who do you think she's going to think they're laughing at? Her. Now, they could have been laughing at anything, probably anything but her. But right then, without any real proof, what did she just affirm in her own belief system? I'm unlikable. I'm not cool. There's something wrong with me. They're laughing at me, right? You see how, and that happens thousands of times. Not once. Every day she walks through that school. If we don't correct that thing, that's being rethought over and over and over again. And that's what he's talking about, the cumulative effect of these things. And so what happens is they change schools. Do you think she's going to think she'll be okay then? No. She'll look for the same kind of people that are going to do. And so how do we change those things? We can. We can. There's hope today. So tell the person next to you, in case I scared them, there's hope today, all right? They didn't hear you. Let's try that again, all right? All right. That was the worst hope I've ever, no, anyways, that was okay. All right, so look at the top of page 3 there, and you'll see it. It's a perceived trauma. Perceived trauma plus helplessness plus the implicit or memories we don't necessarily remember of earlier trauma equals that emotional pain reaction, okay? And so it's the kind of emotional pain where we feel great need to regulate it right now, okay? And it leads to anything we have to do to escape it, whether it's, denial, whether it's running away from the situation, whether it's numbing ourselves out. That leads to all kinds of different escapes. We could put it in the body and we start getting chronic illnesses, other symptoms, okay? Now, part of the thing we want to do is that we want to start learning a better emotional language, okay? More precise. And so on page 3 here, the formula we used earlier, right above it, said perceived trauma. And I was deliberate in using that choice of words because many times the trauma we're reacting to is perceived. It's not actual trauma. There was not a monster in the basement. But to me, there was something there. I was afraid of it, but there really wasn't there, okay? And a lot of our fears are perceived. We were deliberate in that choice of words. Many times the trauma we're reacting is perceived and it's not actual trauma. If we're going to stop from reacting when we are triggered, we'll need to be able to distinguish between the different levels of threat. Many of our deep emotions ruminate over and over again inside our heads. Our thoughts, our self-talk, moving so fast, it can also often be confusing and misleading assumptions, beliefs, and thoughts. And so we're going down this pathway and we're not stopping to really think about it. Am I correct? Is this really true, right? Our implicit memory, bodily and visceral sensations, immature childhood belief system, they cause us to feel certain ways. All inside our heads, it's difficult to look at what we're feeling rationally. Instead, we're simply driven by these strong impulses, emotions and habits, okay? And now to stop them, we need, these deep habitual pathways, we have to stop and integrate our left brain logic, okay? And language is one of those tools. Fear comes in different sizes and shapes, right? Anxiety comes in different sizes and shapes. We need a more precise language, okay? Not all emotions the same. There's a difference between love and lust, for example, right? There's a difference between, in anger, between rage and irritation. Our brain is a predicting machine and uses assumptions to predict the future. You ever been around children? I've been babysitting lately, and all of a sudden, sometimes they can react in real anger towards something that really was just an irritation. It wasn't a life threat, But they've learned that the louder you get, perhaps the more people react, and all this. And all of a sudden they're fighting over something that wasn't really a life-threatening situation. And when you really look at it, it was a small irritation, and it became a habitual reaction. You got to remember, we got to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? Why am I reacting? There's a lot of times there's a gain. Anger, there's a lot of gain. Acting angry like that does what? Gets rid of the person, right? Or gets them off my back. Instead of having to solve something, I'll just blow up and I won't have to deal with it. Well, same thing with sadness, same thing with anxiety. If I can just be anxious enough, they'll leave me alone. We have to ask ourselves honestly sometimes, what am I gaining from this behavior? Sometimes there's a gain, and we have to remember that a lot of times anxiety is a choice. We have a choice. I'll never forget when I was in the height of the anxiety in my 20s and that, because mine lasted a long, long time, 15, 20 years I was working with it. And I remember the book came out, Happiness is a Choice. And I never thought of it that way before. And the book was okay, but the title is what grabbed me. And I thought, well, gee, if happiness is a choice, maybe anxiety's been a choice. And it really started me thinking that, I have a choice? And I think it's important that we know that we have a choice today, okay? And that's exciting. Now, it may not feel like it at first, but as we add all these things together, you're going to see that we're going to have a lot more choice than we thought. Well, one thing that will help sometimes is to have a more precise language of what we're really reacting to. So look at page 4 there. I took some different emotional words, and there's other ones out there. Some people have pinwheels, with it and that, and you can look up different emotions if you want. But what I'd like you to do is take this home and look at it and ask yourself, okay, which one of these words, is it fear, anger, surprise, some of these, but look at the fear category since we're talking about anxiety. There's different kinds of words. There's horror, nervousness, hopeless despair. There's huge differences in those words. And we need to start to be able to characterize or what kind of anxiety we're having. Is it an alarm, a shock, a fear, a fright, a terror, a panic, hysteria? Or is it a tenseness, an uneasiness, an apprehension, a distress? Is it, helplessness, And so there's different degrees, and, we need to be able to pick up some of our things. Now, some of it may come in the area of disappointment as you look at sadness down. Sometimes our anxiety is over what's going to happen. I'm going to be disappointed. I'm distressed. I'm discontent. So a lot of times it helps us to look at some of the words and say, what am I really sensing here? What am I feeling? Because the good news is I don't need a one-fits-all size reaction. A lot of times we're freaking out, we're anxiety, we're being over anxious to something that maybe we don't need that level of anxiety, and just being clearer on what's going on here might allow us just to bring it down a notch or two. Does that make a little sense? If we can start to figure out what am I really sensing here, I think that will help, okay? Well, there's 3 different ways that we can, and there's probably more, but 3 that we teach in here that can help us with anxiety, and you can see them on the top of page 5. We've already talked about correcting our thinking, and we need to be, we need to look at the logic of what's bothering us. We need to be our own detective. We need to treat our own self with self-compassion just like we would someone else. If someone came to you with the same anxiety that you have and explained your situation to you, their situation that's like yours to you, how would you comfort them? What would you say? What would you want them to think about? How would you challenge that? Now maybe you'd just listen for a while, but eventually would there be something that you could say that might help them? Well, if so, why aren't we saying that to ourselves? Why aren't we starting to correct some of our own thinking? Remember, we react so quick. So a lot of this is going to come at looking at the past. How did I was anxious last week. What was that about? Or, I really had a horrible time last night. What was that about? Or 2 months ago when I was at a certain event, I really freaked out and I had to go home. What was that about? Use a case example. Learn from the past. Let's use that. And here again, be your own observer. You don't have to go into it as a participant. Be an observer. Watch yourself and expect. Separate yourself from it, but because you can do both, right? You can sense what was going on without being in the terror of it. You can sense and allow yourself to feel some of the emotion without having to actually go through all the horribleness of it. And you can start to ask yourself, what was I believing? What am I thinking? And so we can do that. The other is that we can regulate our body reactions. Because the thinking is going to come once the amygdala calms down. Next week we're going to start talking about some of them. We're going to talk about posture. We'll talk about some of the different things that we can do. We'll talk about breathing next week. How many breathe in here? Anyone breathe? All right, we're going to talk about some different ways we can breathe, all right? That will kind of calm us down. Following week we'll talk about relaxation, how we can do different kinds of relaxing techniques and stuff. And then we'll get back into some of how can we change what we're really thinking? Well, how can we change some of those deep-seated beliefs? So that's kind of where we're going. Now, we react to emotions in different ways. If you look at the top of 5, how do we react? There's many ways to react to the emotional pain that we feel. And I use the word pain specifically because the same part of the brain that lights up when you touch a hot stove lights up when you feel anxiety. The same part. So it's like a pain in a sense. It gets you to move. It has the same reaction from the brain as if it was a physical thing, okay? And the reactions that we have are usually fight, flight, or freeze. Now, I've added one from the years that I've studied this, and I call it fix, mainly because I've been a people pleaser. I've been, codependent relationship type things. And so you can look at the 4 columns on the bottom of 5 there, and you'll see fight, flight, freeze, and fix. And let's look at some of those different things, because you may have a certain way that you react to your anxiety. All right, and it's important because that reaction might be a cue to you to say, whoa, hold it, stop. I'm starting to do that again. What am I feeling? What am I anxious about? And it might allow you to start thinking, even though you're in the middle. For example, getting angry. That's a fight. Well, wouldn't it be nice if all of a sudden you realize that you're starting to get angry? And not just notice it after you see broken things laying on the floor, and someone else running away from you, Wouldn't it be nice if you could sense when you're starting to get angry? And so you need to know some of these things. Maybe it's being a rebel. And, a lot of us get that, automatic reaction. No. No. And it becomes a habitual no. It's easier to say no than it is to say yes. Something about it, yes, I'm just going to say no. Some of us have that. That's our reaction to something of losing control, perhaps, right? Sometimes it's scary. We get anxious because it's a control issue. Yelling, hurting people physically or verbally, controlling a situation, dominating a person, getting critical, humiliating people. There's a lot of these things that we need to sometimes see, am I doing this? Because it's not too late to correct these things. But uncorrected, it doesn't make for good relationships. Another column is flight. Now, that's where we escape. We want to get out of it. Maybe it's daydreaming. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's avoid talking about things. We just don't want to talk about it. We just won't deal with it. Maybe we push people away, or now, we're constantly sick. We got this, doctors can't figure it out, but man, we just got all these body ailments. And a lot of it could be due to anxiety and stress, right? And our body bears the brunt of it. It could be avoiding conflict, right? Another one is freeze. Now, this is something I went into. I was more into the flight and freeze. And that's where, you can get phobias where you just won't deal with it. You dissociate where you're kind of like floating, you're kind of out of it. Panic attacks kind of things. Or you're just stuck and your brain is just rotating. You can't let it go. You might detach a little bit and just, I'm not just a total avoidance. You're not even dealing with reality. And that it has this kind of hyper panic kind of feeling to it. And that's where I was a lot. Now, the fix is where, in order not to get into some of these things, we tend to fix things. And so we acquiesce to the situation. We subjugate ourselves to the other person. We placate. We people please. That panic that comes from someone not being happy with me would cause me to want to freeze or take flight. And rather than do that, I'll do anything. I'll fix it. And so for me, I'm not going to get any clues from flight or freeze because I ain't going to get there, because I'm going to fix it. You see what I'm saying? And that people-pleasing becomes very obsessive. It becomes very, the thought of someone being upset with me just terrorizes kind of thing. And so I needed to work on that, you see. And so I would have never got there. I would have looked at this list and said, well, gee, I'm not doing any of these. Why? Because I was in the fix column. I was old enough now, I knew how to deal with it. But I wasn't really dealing with it at all. It kept the anxiety alive. I was being run by anxiety. Does that make sense? That's why I added that, because I think there's a lot of us in that boat. We're coping. That's a coping mechanism almost. Okay? And you can look at a lot of these as coping. If that word helps you figure out what you're doing, then use it. How are you coping with your anxiety? Because we want to do more than cope. Okay? And there is hope for those of us that cope, all right? I won't make you say that to each other, but I felt like it, though. All right, now, page 6 here. The question is, how do we regulate our emotions? How do we become resilient? How do we bounce back, right? Return to peace and joy and calm down. And so that's what we're going to look at. We want to go from being reactive to being receptive. And if we can use that term, you can underline that, receptive and reactive, because it's a key word here. Anxiety is a reactive state, okay? And what we want to do is be able to be receptive of the situation long enough to see if we need to be anxious, okay? Now, you're walking into the street, a truck's coming down, you don't want to be too receptive at that point, okay? A reaction might be the stronger thing there. But we're not talking about that kind of thing. We're talking about these anxieties that we're struggling with. And the question is, are we being receptive, or are we going right into a hyper-anxious state? And so we want to look at some of those, okay? So how do we get away from reacting and move toward receptivity? Well, number one, we want to stop and realize what's going on. What's going on, okay? And so that's part of the reason we want to be able to see some of the things that are happening in our body. We want to sense what's going on in our body. So as soon as we feel, some of the things, and we'll get to that in a minute, we want to be able to slow it down, right? Slow, all of a sudden go in that slow mode. So we know, okay, something's happening here. I'm feeling it, long enough to get us to be able to think and not necessarily act, sort of like I was, right? One foot was out that door, ready to run. The other says, no, you aren't going to run yet, right? And I say, I'm older, I can do this. And I looked, and finally I saw it was my mom's dress, right? Well, that's kind of coming into a maturity, because that's, I was older then when that happened, and I felt embarrassed to myself, but, because I should be over this, but that's not the nature sometimes of phobias and fears, right? Doesn't necessarily have an age limit to it. So I had to plant one foot where I went and stop, and that's what we have to do, slow it down, plant that foot, and we'll talk about grounding next week and some other things, okay? So a lot of times if we can slow it down, and I put right in the middle of that page, you can circle that. What am I feeling? What am I thinking? What's the consequences of what I'm afraid? And we kind of went over that last week, but I put a chart here for you and gave an example, and you can take it home and look at it. So for example, a body sensation may be like a sullen chest, okay? You're kind of like this. And the emotion then might be sadness. The negative belief is I'm defective. The perceived consequence of being defective is defective things get disposed of. Now here's where the anxiety starts to come in. Just being defective, some things I'm defective of, I could care less. But if it's a deep-rooted, oh boy, somehow I'm gonna, this is a real defection, something's really wrong with me, then the presumed thing is I'm gonna be disposed of, and what's the end result of that? I'm gonna die. Am I gonna die as an adult? No. But as a child, where a lot of these things came from, abandonment and rejection is a death sentence to a child. I mean, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable. And you've heard the term gaslighting and things like that. People that use that kind of stuff want to keep you vulnerable. They want you to keep you in a place where you feel something's wrong with you. You're crazy. Things are right. You're defective. They want to keep you in that state of mind where you believe it. And the thing is, those are lies. And when we can start to say, look at another one here, slumped shoulders. The emotion is shame. Now, shame is a hard one, and I was shame-based. A lot of my stuff came out of this shame-based feeling about myself. And shame's a hard one, shame, And the negative beliefs, I'm unwanted. Well, unwanted things get discarded, and then I'll become a non-being. Do you see as you go down farther, they're very similar? I mean, it's not much difference, because really once you start getting there, defective things, damaged things, the end result is to a young child, I'm going to die. I'm going to be I'm going to annihilate. And it's that kind of fear that grows up with us. And part of maturity is seeing that that's not true. But we'll never get there if we keep acting out in anxiety. Did you see? We never stop to get to that place. Logically, it makes sense. But we're not dealing with logic. We're dealing with the emotions here. We're dealing with bodied beliefs. It's in our body. We've got to retrain that, okay? And so I just wanted to give you some, tightness in chest, butterflies, right? That's fear and anxiety. I'm exposed. Now, that's a common one. This feeling of someone, if they only knew what I was like, they wouldn't like me. If they only knew the real me, and we go hiding these things, right? And there may not even be anything wrong with us, but it feels like it. So the question is, in each one, is what's the truth? What's the truth? Well, the truth, look at the bottom one. I'm not going to die. I can give it up to God. God created me. He will never leave me. I am safe. I'm protected by God. His love casts out all fear. There's a truth. We don't end with a lie. We start to believe the truth. But we don't just believe it here. We need to believe it here. And that's emotionally relearning the truth. And so this truth needs to be emotionally learned. And that's where we'll learn that we can do it different ways. One is through experience. As we experience it more and more, our brain starts to understand this is true. I don't have to run from that. There's nothing to be afraid of. So experience helps it. Sometimes it's that aha. Oh, is that what that meant? You found out a secret, that really amplified everything, that said, oh, Mom didn't mean that, oh, great. Now the whole logic of your fear is dismissed. Sometimes it's a certain aha like that. And so there's different things that we'll talk about, okay? So the next thing, not only do we need to know name the sensations, we need to sometimes feel where it's in the body, okay, where it's in the body. Because that's the clue. They start as sensations first, and so we want some body awareness practice. And you can see that on page 7. And what I want you to do is start thinking about some of the anxiety that you've had, and where do you feel it in your body? And not just where you feel it, but what does it feel like? And you can see a bunch of words that I've put here. This Alison Saran came up with a bunch of different ones, that help us sometimes explain our sensations, right? It's floaty, or it's grounded, it's hard, it's lengthy, it's hot, it's light, playful, different kinds of words. And somehow we need to be able to describe it a little bit better. And so one of the things I've done here is allow you to do a body scan, for example, on page 8. And what you can do, and I'm going to take you through this again in a few weeks, but let's go through it real briefly here. And that is, you can start with your head and what you want to do in your neck and that, and you just want to ask yourself, do I feel any pressure? Is there any soreness, any tightness? And then what you want to do is see if you need to relax. Okay, let's say that, your neck's a little stiff. Well, just breathe and relax and see if it calms down. If it calms down, is there a difference? You want to be able to tell the difference between what it's like when it's tight and what it's like when it's relaxed. Because if you can start to figure out what that's like, right, then you'll know that's a clue that, maybe I'm tense, maybe I'm upset, maybe something's going on here. And so you can do that with each, like the forehead, are you, like this? You'd be amazed how many times we're going around like this, and then you kind of relax and you go, oh man, does that feel different, Well, what's this mean? What kind of look is that? Besides horrible, it's a worried look, right? A worried look. Are we walking around all worried? Well, when we relax it, all of a sudden we can feel difference. But guess what the norm might be? This. You'd be surprised how a lot of the things are our normal. We're hyper vigilant, walking around like this all day long. And until we do a body scan to see if it's there, and then to relax and see if it feels different, we'll never be aware. We want to know what some of these sensations are, where we can start to sense that, maybe I'm in a worried state. Maybe I'm in an anxious state. Because that's when we can start saying, what's going on? What am I thinking? What am I believing? Now, again, most of the time we're probably going to have to go back to something that just happened, because it takes practice to be able to catch these things. But that's okay. As we analyze what happened before, we can start to get better at catching it in the moment. We want to start to catch it in the moment, okay? And so you can take this and do it at home, practice, just relax a little bit. I'll teach you how to relax it better as we go into relaxation, I believe, next week. Or no, 2 weeks from now. But right now, what I want you to practice is getting used to feeling if there's tension, soreness, anything in these different parts of the body, okay? And then go to page 10 here. Where do you sense some of these things? Where do you sense sadness? Where do you feel fear? Where do you feel anger? Where do you feel shame? What parts of the body? And I want you to kind of look at that and start asking yourself, okay, what kind of, what am I happening when I feel fear? Or grief or sadness, maybe some of these, but focus on anxiety for right now. Where do I feel different anxiety? And then I put in a square over here, I want you to see if it's got a certain shape or size. Is it a knot in the stomach? If so, what size is that knot? Is it, as you close your eyes, is it the size of a softball? Now, it's not logically, literally a soft, but does it feel like a heavy weight? Or is it just like a pinprick? is that, if you can start to sense that a little bit and see that there's different techniques that we'll be using, it will help us dissolve that. We can dissolve that kind of thing. We can get rid of that kind of sensation if we can start to identify it. If we feel that our anxiety is in here and now we start to feel it, then we can use our breathing technique that we'll get into to just kind of breathe it away. There's other techniques that we can do that we'll be teaching you that will help you, make it smaller and smaller and dissolve. I do this with pain. I teach people how to get rid of pain using methods like this. Because if we can take the pain and isolate it, give it a shape and a size, we can kind of mentally dissolve it for those moments that we're in it. So I want you to, as homework here, to really think about your anxiety. You don't have to do the anger. Shame you might want to a little bit if that's part of your thing, maybe disgust, all that, whatever you feel. But I want you to be able to really try this week to get a hand on what it feels like, where is it at in the body, what's it, because here again, we want to start to recognize before it starts to happen. I've been able to overcome panic attacks because I started to realize when they were happening, right? And I remember one time saying, oh, I'm having a panic attack. And it went, because then I can ride the wave. One of our techniques is to ride the wave. Well, if you miss the wave, you aren't going to ride. It's going to ride you, right? I'll learn that when I boogie board in California. But anyways, you wait for the right wave. Well, if that anxiety's coming, you want to ride it. And because a wave, then that's exactly what anxiety is. It's a wave. It will dissipate. It will dissipate. We retrain our brain when we ride the wave, you see? But if we keep missing the wave, if we keep going into our big anxiety, we need to learn when that wave is starting to happen, where we can say, okay, treat it like a false alarm. If all of a sudden, our nature says we're scared, guys, we have to exit the building, especially if we smell some smoke, right? Or the kitchen is right there, the door's open, we see some flames. That would add to our anxiousness to get out of the building. But if it went off and none of us smelled anything, none of us saw anything, the fireman came and said, well, nothing happened, fine, we resume class and it goes off again. All right, got to exit the building, come back in, goes off again. What do you think I'm going to feel like by the 6th time? Am I going to say, well, gee, we got to get out of here? Yes, legally I would. But I'd feel like saying, just stay there, this is nothing but what? False alarm. It's faulty wiring. We need to repair it. Most of our anxiety is faulty alarms. But it's an alarm. And alarms we're trained to take seriously. So, we're going to have to ignore it for a while. It's going to be hard to ignore that for a while. We're going to have to ride the until it dissipates. And it's going to be counterintuitive. It's going to be counter to what we feel because we got to go. It's an alarm. But if you can go into it believing it's faulty wiring to begin with, which leads to a false alarm, I don't have to listen to it. I can trust Ron. No, I don't know if you want to do that, but trust me anyway. No, but if you can trust that it is, you'll be amazed at how you'll be able to ride the wave and wait it out. And all you need to do is do it once, twice, three, and boy, all of a sudden the brain starts saying, I don't got to be scared of this. I got my big boy clothes on, whatever, right? We're maturing. It's a maturing process. We are adults, and we can do this. We can do this. I hope that's making some sense, because what we're going to do is we're going to teach some of the techniques that will slow it down. And so, the second, we want to react more positively. We want to start, now look at page 12, we'll finish here, okay? Some of the negative ways that we handle it is to isolate. Isolation is a kiss of death. If you've got phobias that's keeping you home and you're not going places like that, get some help. Get some help. There's plenty of professionals out there. If you don't know who to go, you can call me. I can refer you if you need to, but get some help. There's no shame in getting help. You don't need to isolate. Isolation is not going to help. And that's easy for me to say. I know a time in my life when I wanted to isolate, okay? I do. But don't isolate. We can overcome this, all right? Other times we go into a panic mode, right? We want to start realizing if we're in a panic. Don't be embarrassed. If you're panicking 3 or 4 times a week, all that says is that you're panicking 3 or 4 times a week. Let's work on it, right? Let's get that down. These things are workable. We can work on these things. Sometimes we keep busy and worrying, right? And we keep so busy and worrying on it and that we never face what's bothering us. We numb it, and boy, that's where addictions come in. We medicate to regulate our emotions. It's one of the strongest sayings in addictions. We medicate, self-medicate to regulate our emotions, and unfortunately, many of the programs don't deal with the emotional part of addictions that much, and that's what we're trying to change. This started out as an addictions program. Because we were working in it and we felt that, we need to talk about these emotions, right? And so, and other times we become helpless, learned helpless. We just give up. We become depressed. Anxiety turns into depression. And so if any of those things are familiar to you, then this should be a clue that, hey, maybe along with what we're doing here, we should get some professional help. There's nothing wrong with that, okay? So be aware of some of those things. And then you can see on page 13 some of the things we're going to get into. We're going to, down on the bottom of the page, we're going to talk about breathing, grounding, relaxation. We're going to talk about affirmations, using our imagination, our posture, and spiritual disciplines. And we're going to do that in a period of 2 weeks, so get ready. We're going to be running, but we can do it. So I'm hoping that you're putting some time in at home on this. I mean, I could stretch this into a 30-week class. It'd be no problem, and we really could. But I'm hoping that you'll stretch it by taking some of these things, looking at them, doing some of the work, okay? And so let's pray and ask God to help us as we get down, and we're going to start next week some of the things. And I think for many of us, we'll start seeing immediate results because some of these techniques will at least slow the body down, and then the thinking can follow, okay? So let's ask God to do that for us. Father, you know us. You know each one here and each one watching. And Lord, you know how anxiety can just eat us up. And Father, we want change. And Lord, we want things to be different in our lives. And so, Father, help us. Give us the wisdom we need. Help us to look this over again and start to really understand some of it. Help us to learn some of the techniques that will help us ride the wave. And Lord, help us learn the truth to overcome some of these lies that we believe about ourselves. So, Father, thank you that you care. Thank you, Lord, that it's not your will that we become anxious, that, Lord, your perfect love can cast out all fear. So I ask that for each one of us, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.